Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here, once again with another Elder Scrolls Online Let's Talk segment. Today we'll be discussing the Mage's Guild skill line in Elder Scrolls Online, how it fits into the meta, when and where to use the abilities, and what I'd like to see done with the overall theme, if at all. We'll kick things right off with explaining how to get XP with the Mage's Guild, because again, like Fighter's Guild and a few of our other skill lines, it's not going to operate the same well in skill progression, where you just have to have it slotted, or just get normal XP to advance the skill line. In order to join the Mage's Guild, you must sign a contract, and it's going to be the similar way to Fighter's Guild, where we're going to spawn in our main town. So for AD, we're going to spawn in Vilcal Guard, and we're going to go to the Mage's Guild here, sign a contract. If we are Daggerfall Covenant, we're going to be in Daggerfall, and we're going to go to the Mage's Guild here. And then if we are EP, we will start in Davin's Watch, and the Mage's Guild will be here. So all you do, you go there, you talk to an NPC, you'll get about 40 gold for just hitting E a few times, and you have officially joined the Mage's Guild. It should be noted that if you manage to gain Mage's Guild experience prior to joining the Mage's Guild, it will be retroactive. So you will gain any experience you may have gained without joining. Places like Fighter's Guild or Undaunted will not do that. You have to join them prior to gaining XP. So all you do is that, and then the way to get Mage's Guild is to do Mage's Guild quests, which will give about 10 XP per, or you can find Mage's Guild lore books scattered throughout Tamriel. When I open up my map, you might see all these books. This is from an add-on called Lore Books. It's really easy if you're on PC. You can just install it, and it'll just pop up a bunch of lore books. Otherwise, there are guides all over the interwebs that you can look for and just like post up on a laptop or something, or a tablet, and then use when you're on your console like PS4 or Xbox. So collecting each book gives 5 experience, and then if you complete a zone, you'll get a bulk of experience based on how many books were there. You can check it by looking at your Edict memory, the lore book thing in your tab. You press J, that's the default key on PC, and it'll open up Shalador's library, and these are all the lore books in the game. And then if you learn one, you can reread it later if you aren't into RP or anything. So yeah, each book 5 XP, each quest 10 XP, completing a zone a bunch of XP, usually 20 to 30 for each zone you complete. So in order to get Mage's Guild 1 to 10, it's going to take about 2/3 of the game's zones. So all of the zones in one faction, all of the zones in another, and then a few zones in the third, because there's going to be lore books in all of the zones that are unique. Then there's going to be lore books in Cyrodiil. There will be lore books in dungeons. They're scattered all over the place, and each one gives 5. So now that that's out of the way, you've joined the Mage's Guild, you've gotten some experience, now we can start using skills. And our first active ability is going to be Mage Light. And Mage Light is going to work similarly to Fighter's Guild Expert Hunter. It's going to have 2 components, one active and one passive. So we look here, it costs max magicka, it's a pretty hefty cost, and it's going to last 6 seconds, which is a buff, and then it's going to have a 6 meters radius. And what that radius refers to is when you activate Mage Light, similarly to Expert Hunter, you gain True Sight. So you reveal any stealthed or invisible enemies around you in that 6 meters AoE radius for 6 seconds. And then if you manage to spot someone with this, then they cannot return to stealth or invisibility for 3 seconds. Pretty straightforward. It just allows you to deal with pesky Nightblades or people using invis pots trying to escape or get the gank on you. So a very strong tool in disposing of a lot of burst damage. And this is going to be one of our strongest counters to prevent being ganked. And there will be another morph that will even furthermore increase that capability to do so. And then our passive component, which we're going to gain for slotting it, is called Major Prophecy. Just going to increase our spell critical by 2191 rating, which means 10% spell critical at champion point 160. So really straightforward, going to get some crit for slotting it, and then we're going to have an active component that will remove any pesky Nightblades or invis users. in and of itself, a decent ability. It's not going to be very strong in the base morph, but once we start to morph it and we gain passives, then it's going to be a very, very important tool in Magicka builds and healers. But now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Inner Light. And Inner Light is going to be our go-to non-PvP morph. And even some PvPers take Inner Light. Because what Inner Light does is while you have this ability slotted, you increase your max Magicka. And at rank 4, it's going to be 5% additional max Magicka. At rank 1, it's level 2%, and then it goes to 5% at rank 4. And then there's going to be a passive that will further augment this, which I will explain later. So 5% max Magicka for slotting, 10% spell critical for slotting, and any PvE caster build that does DPS is going to double bar Inner Light, unless they have another source of Major Prophecy and they're not going to be on their back bar much. So like a Dragon Knight might use Flames of Oblivion on their back bar instead of Inner Light, because they're not going to be on their back bar as much, so they don't have to worry about that. But they can still double bar it if they so choose. Caster Nightblades, Caster Templars, and Sorcerers, they're all going to double bar Inner Light in PvE because it's going to give a lot of max Magicka. Roughly 2 to 3k in endgame performance, sometimes even more depending on your race, depending on how much max Magicka you have, like from stats and stuff. So this is going to be an extremely important tool in giving us some free damage, as well as being able to be utilized by healers, because more max Magicka means more casts, which means stronger heals, yada yada. So a very, very centerpiece tool in forming a Magicka DPS or healer class in the Elder Scrolls Online. So a really, really strong morph, just going to be a bunch of free stats just for slotting. Our other morph is called Radiant Mage Light, and this is going to reduce the cost and increase that radius from 6 to 12 meters, and it's also going to make it so while we have this slotted, we take 50% less damage from sneak attacks, and we can no longer be stunned from sneak attacks. So this is the morph that I was talking about that further increased our capabilities to snuff out gankers, to get rid of them, to be able to deal with them. Having Radiant Mage Light gives you an aura that makes you and any ally standing in it within 12 meters immune to being stunned from sneak attacks, and you take 50% less damage from them. So that means that Nightblade who's trying to gank you and one-shot you from stealth, no longer possible because Radiant Mage Light is simply slotted. So just having this skill is going to completely remove the one aspect that Nightblades have in PvP, that really, really toxic jump out of stealth, destroy you because stuns. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to do that if they're running proc sets and they ambush and use like incapacitating strikes. They're still going to do a lot of damage. You can still be stunned from other attacks that are outside of stealth. So it's not going to make you invincible, but it's severely going to lower a ganker's damage output from stealth. So you're going to have the ability to react and put them on the defensive and get on the offensive rather than you just sitting there spamming shields trying to heal and outlast. So a very, very strong tool in removing stealth from Cyrodiil. And in PvE, remember we talked in Fighters Guild that stealth isn't prevalent at all in PvE, so we're not going to have any need for this morph in PvE. So we're always going to take Inner Light, just because it's a bunch of free stats. So Radiant Mage Light going to give that juicy immunity to stun from sneak attacks, 50% less damage from stealth attacks, and then going to give us that 10% spell crit and that active ability. And then again, Inner Light going to do the active ability to remove stuff in a 6 meters radius instead of radiance 12, and then a bunch of max Magicka, 5% at rank 4, and then that 10% spell crit. So very, very amazing skill just for having it slotted, and then you have the option to cast it for a few reasons which I'll explain further that interact with the passive. But now we'll look at our next active ability, and that is called Entropy. And Entropy is going to scale off of our max Magicka, spell damage, spell critical, and spell penetration. So we already talked about what Entropy scales with, all of its stuff, But how the skill is going to work is you're going to cast it on a target. It's going to deal damage over a 12-second duration, and it's going to heal you every 6 seconds. So there's going to be 3 heals to it, because one is going to be an initial, then there's going to be one after 6 seconds, and then one after 12 seconds. And then damage is going to happen every 2 seconds. So that means that 2.4-second duration we're getting from our passive is literally useless. We're not gaining any offensive damage from it because it's not applying to the debuff that it does. The debuff is there, but it doesn't increase the dot duration or the hot duration. So the heal is going to scale with the same stuff, the max magicka, spell damage, spell critical, etc. But it's also going to use Blessed and Elfborn in the champion point system instead of Thaumaturge and Elemental Expert. Pretty straightforward skill, not going to boast a lot of DPS, but it will also grant the user Major Sorcery, increasing our spell damage by 20% for 20 seconds after activating. And that 20-second duration is going to be unaffected by our passive that increases duration. So it's going to be 20 seconds no matter what. Really, really nice, because it means that we don't have to keep up Entropy's damage over time function, because it's really, really lackluster. So I'll explain here what I was talking about. So I cast the skill, there's the initial hit, and there's the initial heal, and then we see every 2 seconds I'm dealing damage. There is our first heal tick, and then we're going to get, and then here's our third heal tick. So we got 3 heal ticks and 8 damage sources, and we noticed after 12 seconds we stopped doing damage. I can open up my recap here. There was 3 entropy heals, and there was 8 entropy damage ticks over the 14.4 seconds. So this proves that this has stopped dealing damage after 12 seconds. So we're losing a lot of efficiency, even though our passive should be increasing the damage of it. In and of itself, not going to be a good skill in PvE at all, but in PvP, it's going to be decent if we have bar space, because it's going to give us some passives for slotting, which I'll explain later. It's going to give us a passive component when we activate it, which I'll, again, explain later. And then it's going to give us Major Sorcery, increasing our spell damage by 20%. So this means that we don't have to use spell power potions, so we can use things like immovability pots, or tripods, or something else to increase our efficiency in combat with players rather than maximizing our damage. And we don't have to run silly sets like Rattle Cage or something that's going to increase our spell damage, because we can have this on a bar spot. Because in terms of efficiency, it's better to give up 1 bar spot than 5 slots of gear. So it's going to make more sense to run sorcery either from our skills or from potions. So this is going to be a good skill if we don't want to run sets like Rattle Cage, which are really going to lower our efficiency. So it's not a useless skill, but it's not a very strong one. It's going to give us a lot of passive bonuses, which are more catered to PvP, because we're going to have Major Sorcery from spell power potions, because we don't need to use tripods, we don't need to use immovability potions in PvE. There's no need for them. So we're going to use Major Sorcery pots, and we don't need to run an ability to do that. And then the damage over time function is going to be really, really weak in PvE. The heal is going to be extremely lackluster in PvE, so it's just not going to go on our bar. But in PvP, it's going to give us those bonus stats. But now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Degeneration. And what Degeneration does is, while this debuff is active, our light and heavy attacks have a chance to heal us for the damage that they cause. So we see here, your light attacks have a 15% chance to heal you for 100% of the damage caused, and that 100% will scale. So I think it goes up to about 108% at rank 4, meaning that every time we do a light or heavy attack, we'll have a small chance to heal us for the damage. Not really going to do much, because it's going to be a percent based, so it's not going to give us consistent healing, and the 14-second duration is going to be kind of lackluster in terms of like what this skill operates. So we're not going to run this skill, because we don't run Degeneration for a heal or Entropy for a heal, because it's extremely extremely weak. And furthermore, in PvP, this is going to get hit by Battle Spirit because our damage is going to be halved, so our light attacks aren't going to be that important. Weaving is going to be a little bit more difficult to do in Cyrodiil because there's so much going on, performance issues, yada yada. So Degeneration's not going to really bring us anything great to the table. Our other morph, on the other hand, is called Structured Entropy, and what that does is while you passively slot this, you're going to gain 5% max health at rank 1 and 8% at rank 4. So for having this skill slotted, you gain 8% additional health. So in PvE, not going to be that good again because we don't really need that. We don't have the bar space because we need DPS abilities. But in PvP, if we need Major Sorcery, Entropy is our go-to candidate for that because we don't want to run pots, we don't want to waste a 5-piece armor set, so we can just run this on 1 bar. We don't have to double bar it, we can swap off and retain the bonuses. So we can gain that 20% Major Sorcery, we can gain the passives from our passive abilities, and then we're going to get 8% more max health, which is further amplified by Battle Spirit, because Battle Spirit's going to give us a flat amount of health, and that will get that percent increase. So Structured Entropy is going to be a really great tool in PvP for builds who don't have Major Sorcery built into them and want to have that option, because it's going to have a decent duration, it's going to require a target, so it means you won't get the full burst unless you open up with Entropy, but it's going to give that spell damage, it's going to give a bunch of passives, and then it's going to give that 8% max health. So a really, really great skill just for passively slotting, and then a few active abilities that we gain from it. So again, meta performance, neither of these good in PvE whatsoever. Do not use these skills. But in PvP, Structured Entropy is going to be a really nice tool. And I guess there is one application in which Structured Entropy will be decent in PvE, and that's on really high health tank builds. While it isn't meta at all, but if you have a free slot, like you have your major buffs taken care of, you have major evasion, you have group utility already, and you have a free slot, and you're wondering what to do, you can put on Structured Entropy and just get some free health, so you can hit that 30k health mark a little bit easier, so you can prevent being one-shot. So it's going to be some free health, but in PvE, really not that good, and most tanks don't need this skill to hit that mark, so I do not suggest running it, but it is an option. Now we'll look at our next ability, and that is Fire Rune. And Fire Rune is going to scale with our max magicka, spell damage, spell critical, and spell penetration, because it deals flame damage. And since it deals flame damage, it's going to scale with Elemental Expert in the champion point system. We see here it has a pretty high cost. It's going to have a 3-meter AoE radius because we're going to place it down at a reticle. We can cast it up to 28 meters away, and it's going to place a rune on the ground that lasts up to 36 seconds. And this is with our duration increase, so it's 30-second base. And what happens is it takes 2 seconds to arm, similarly to rearming trap, before it can be activated, but if an enemy walks over it, it will trigger and explode for flame damage. So I'll demonstrate here. It pulls up a reticle, and anything that walks inside the reticle, or wherever I cast it, will take damage. So this is it right here. Pretty straightforward. Anytime an enemy walks in, it'll explode. I'll demonstrate on my target skeleton. It takes 2 seconds to arm, and then it'll just blow up for some minor flame damage. So in and of itself, it's not going to be very good because it's extremely noticeable, like a big blue thing on the ground. Don't step in that if you're an enemy. It's not going to do a lot of upfront damage whatsoever. And that's it. There's going to be no real advantages to Fire Rune in its base morph form. If Fire Rune had a damage over time component to it, like Trap Beast, and then gave Minor Force, it would be amazing. This would give caster builds an option to run Minor Force while equalizing Fighter's Guild and Mage's Guild, which ZeniMax wants to do, while making them unique, because Fighter Guild has a rearm version, it's melee range, and it does physical damage, while Mage's Guild has a shorter duration, but it can be casted from a range. So if they increase the duration just a little bit, so if they had like a 6-second dot or a 5-second dot, or maybe not even have a dot, but if you deal damage with this skill, you gain minor force for 10 seconds, this would give casters an option to choose between one of the two. But right now, the base morph just is completely lackluster in both damage and utility, because just dealing a very pitiful amount of damage at a relatively high magicka cost does nothing for us. But now we'll look at our morphs and see if some of that gets alleviated. Our first morph is called Volcanic Rune, and what that's going to do is if an enemy steps in it, on top of taking that initial upfront damage, they're going to be knocked up into the air and then stunned for 3 seconds once they land. So it should be noted that you can CC break it immediately. So if you're being knocked up, you can CC break immediately and then you'll just land on your feet. But if you don't, you'll be knocked up. After that animation, you'll land and then you'll be stunned for 3 seconds. So it's more like a 4 to 5 second stun duration in terms of locking your character out. So it's going to be very, very strong in PvP. So you can place this at a tower entrance. You can place it in Imperial City sewers, like in chokeholds and all of those tight little niched areas where you can just place this and people can walk through and then they'll be knocked up in the air and ready to be killed. So a very good tool in PvP. And then it can disperse enemies in Zergs because it's going to be an AoE. So anyone that walks into the area, when it detonates, they'll all be knocked up. Up to 6 players. So this is going to be a very good tool at like dispersing in raids. You can kind of pop them up, get them scattered about, make them go back on the defensive, and then give yourself time to either rush in to kill them before they CC break, or to regain your composure and let them keep chasing you or whatever to line them up into some heavy bursts. So a very good tool in PvP when used properly, but in PvE, again, going to be extremely weak because it's going to do really weak damage and it's gonna have that really high cost. It doesn't fit into a rotation that's justified where it's going to out damage a spammable ability. So Volcanic Rune has great utility in PvP, not going to do a lot of damage though, and then in PvE, useless skill. Our other morph, however, is called Scalding Rune, and Scalding Rune is going to add a damage over time function that lasts 10 seconds, and that dot duration will be increased by our passive. So let's take this morph so I can demonstrate. The dot duration will not increase with rank, but it is being affected by one of our passives, which I'll explain, and it does about half the damage of the initial hit over the duration. So now, this, again, similar to Entropy, is not being increased by our duration of one of our passives. Like, the dot duration gets increased, but there is no damage source increase because the damage component of it isn't scaling. So remember, Entropy's base form is 12 seconds, so with a duration increase, we should gain 1 additional tick out of Entropy. Yet at 10 seconds, or at 2 seconds, it stops dealing damage. Like, you can see my debuff here, or the buff here, and then it stops dealing damage after 4 seconds are left. So we're missing out on 2 ticks of damage and 1 additional heal because our passive isn't increasing the effectiveness. Same with Scalding Rune. I throw it down, it does an upfront damage, and then it's going to do 5 damage sources of damage over time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. Even though the dot duration is still going, and it's because it isn't in full 2-second intervals. So another skill that is reflected to increase with our passive but isn't being affected by it, really hurting its efficiency of it. It should be noted that Scalding Rune is getting a pretty big buff in Update 13. It's still being decided whether it'll be worth running, I really only think it's going to fit into the Dragon Knight rotation because they have the bar space for it, and it might be out-damaging Flames of Oblivion for the caster DK, but for everyone else, they don't have the damage amps like Flames or World in Ruins or other stuff like that. So Scalding Rune isn't going to be that great in one Tamriel. It needs something more. It needs either more damage or it needs a source of a buff like Minor Force or something of the sort, which I would love to see happen with it, because while it's true that casters are in an advantage right now, my objective or my desire for the game is to get everyone to a healthier spot where there's diversity for everyone. So even though casters are winning, I'd still like to see buffs be given to their kit to breed diversity, so it's not only running the same build on every PvE build or every PvP build. You have options, and making abilities a strong contender for class versions or weapon versions breeds diversity, because you're like, okay, well, where does this skill fit in properly now? Because if Scalding Rune is given Minor Force, does that make it good in PvP versus, say, Wall of Elements or Liquid Lightning? No, because ground AoEs aren't going to be that good in PvP. You don't care about Minor Force in PvP because you're not running crit builds, but it gives PvEers an option. Okay, well, I really want Minor Force, and I don't want to run Trap Beast anymore because I'm a caster build. So I have an option. I have diversity. I could give up a class skill for it. I could give up passives, whatever it may be. You're given incentive to think about your build rather than just doing the same old, same old. So yeah, I'd like to see Scalding Rune either get a damage increase or Minor Force. I really feel like that'd be awesome if it went to the base morph, because right now the base morph is in an awful spot. Volcanic Rune has some decent utility, but as a skill, it's still incredibly niche because it's dealing such little damage. The stun is nice, but I mean, we can get stuns elsewhere in the game, so we don't really need it. We can use something like Destro Touch or whatever, the knockback from Flame Destro, which stuns, or the shock one. Whatever it is, we have much more efficient skills that give us CC other than Volcanic Rune. But now we'll look at our last active ability, and that is Equilibrium. And Equilibrium isn't going to scale anything. It's going to be a self-casted ability, and what you're going to do is you're going to trade some of your current health to gain some additional magicka. And then furthermore, after you cast this skill, you prevent any healing on yourself for the next 4 seconds. But this only refers to self-healing, so it means you can't use your own healing abilities. So if you're a Templar, biting jabs or puncturing sweeps won't heal you. Your ritual won't heal you. Breath of Life won't heal you. Anything that you do will not heal you, but other allies can heal you, meaning that this is going to be a nice tool if we don't have options to get our magicka back and we have a free bar spot in PvE or in PvP if we're with groups of players, like if we're running in a team or a small man or a Zerg even. Other players will still be able to heal you. So I'll demonstrate this skill here. All we do is wave our hand, and it trades some health for max magicka. So let's just spam some magicka. Enter combat so I don't regen at all. So I just trade health for magicka. Really, really easy. But I can't heal during the duration. So let's cast Entropy and then show. See, I'm not getting any healing right now because I have the debuff from Equilibrium on me, and then I get the heal after it vanishes. It should also be noted that you cannot kill yourself with this skill, so no suicidal thoughts. Call the ESO suicide hotline prevention if you see a player using this skill and jumping off a keep to Bloodport. They need help. But yeah, so you can't kill yourself with this skill, but you can get yourself dangerously low. So if you're trying to get magicka in PvE and then you get hit with like a void sphere or a mechanic, you're probably going to die. So use it accordingly. Know when you have safe times to be able to use the skill. Like, okay, the boss just did a heavy attack. I have a few seconds before I can do something. So if you are going to use a skill, which most players won't need to in group application because there's going to be things like minor magicka steal, mystic orbs, healing orbs, lots of sources of magicka recovery, so they're not going to really need Equilibrium. But it's still there, but just make sure you use it when it's safe. Don't just go casting it willy-nilly. But now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Spell Symmetry. And what that's going to do is after the exchange is complete, so after we change health for Magicka, the next casted ability we use that uses Magicka will cost 25% less Magicka. So you can use Spell Symmetry and then a heavy high ability cost, and it's going to reduce the cost by 25% across the board. So really, really nice in terms of efficiency in saving max Magicka. This is going to be our go-to PvE morph if we're going to use the skill at all, which usually, again, we're not going to be, but it will be a niche option. You'll be able to gain Magicka back, so if you're like a Templar or something and you need Magicka back and you're in a group, you can use Spell Symmetry instead of stuff like Radiant Aura or Channeled Focus, although you will be making operational losses between both options. But again, it's an option, and then it's going to increase our Magicka sustain furthermore because it's going to make our abilities cheaper. So yeah, pretty straightforward, just going to reduce the cost of the skill by 25% for the next 6 seconds. Not going to do anything insane, but again, going to help us with resource management. Our other morph is called Balance, and what Balance is going to do is it's going to, after the exchange is complete, give us Major Resolve and Ward for 24 seconds, increasing our physical and spell resistance. This means if you are a tank or you're in PvP and your class does not have a Major Resolve or Ward buff, you can gain both of them for an exchange of only 1784 health. So a very small amount of health, and you'll get Magicka back, and then you'll gain your major buffs for the next 24 seconds. Just keep in mind that if you use this, you cannot heal yourself for the next 4 seconds, so you have to make sure your allies are healing you. Balance is actually insanely underrated, and it's an amazing source of Major Resolve and Ward for classes like the Nightblade who don't have access to it, because their only source is going to be something called Shadow Barrier, which is going to scale in duration based on how much heavy armor we wear, but even so, there are no spammables as a tank in the Shadow skill line, so we're never going to be able to keep up our major buffs permanently. So we have the option of running Balance, and that's going to be a very great tool because it's also going to give us our Magicka back, meaning we can cast more skills. It's going to give us passives for slotting the skill, and then we're going to get our major buff. So a really, really underrated skill because no one really knows about it. Like, even I, before looking through the skill line, I didn't realize Balance had been changed. Way back then, Balance only used to give like minor vitality for the next 3 seconds or something, so you could get additional healing received from your allies. It was really, really weak. But now, it gives classes who don't have access to their major buffs in an easy way to gain it much more efficiently. So a really underrated but niche morph option. So yeah, Spell Symmetry, again, going to be niche in PvE and PvP. Just remember that if you use it, you can't heal yourself, you need an ally to heal you. And then Balance going to be a really niche way to get our major buffs in both PvP and then in PvE tanking. So really underrated skills, but they're still there. They're not going to be insane. They're not going to be a dark deal from a Sork or anything like that, but it's instant cast, and it doesn't cost anything to do other than a little bit of health. So really, really underrated skills, but still strong. Now we'll look at our ultimate, and that is Meteor. And Meteor is going to come in at a pretty hefty 200 ultimate cost. It can be casted up to 28 meters away, and it's going to deal damage on initial hit and damage over time in a 5 meters AoE radius. So it's going to deal flame damage regardless of what our max stats are, but since it is an ultimate, it will scale with whatever stats are highest. If our stamina is higher, it'll do stamina, weapon damage, weapon critical, but spell penetration because it deals flame damage. And then if our max Magicka is higher, it'll use Magicka, spell damage, spell critical, and again, spell penetration. It will also use Elemental Expert and Thaumaturge in the champion point system because it deals flame damage and it is a damage over time component, or it has one. So the initial hit will just be Ele Expert, and then the secondary will be Ele Expert and Thaumaturge. So what you do is you drop it on an enemy. It does some pretty hefty upfront damage. It knocks anyone who is in that 5 meters AoE impact it will knock them up into the air, and then stunning them for 2 seconds after they land. Similarly to Volcanic Rune, you can CC break immediately or whenever you want to, but it's going to last a little bit longer than the 2-second stun duration. And then furthermore, in the area where it landed, it'll deal damage every 1 second for 10 seconds. And then a passive will increase the duration to 11.8 seconds. But since it's not on a full second integer, it will not get the extra 20% duration increase in terms of the dot. So again, another issue with our passive not applying properly to our meteor, because it's not giving it in full set increments, because our skills last either 2 seconds or 1 second, and they don't give the full 2 or 1 second integers where we can gain it. But still, this is going to be a really, really strong morph in both PvE and in PvP. In PvP, it can no longer be reflected, meaning that no matter what, if you drop this on someone, they cannot escape it. As soon as you drop it on them, you know it will hit. Now, you can block it, which will prevent the stun, which will negate a lot of the damage. But if you don't, or you pull it into someone and you're blocking and they're not, they will be knocked up, but you won't be. So you have to be careful. You are a living time bomb for the duration that it is casted on you. So you have to be careful with your positioning. You have to hold block or shield. But it's not going to do a lot of crazy high damage in Cyrodiil anymore, because it's so easily seen and it's blockable and whatnot. So all you do is put on a shield or just hold block, and then as soon as it's landed, dodge roll and you're safe. But if you don't block, then you're going to take a lot of damage. You cannot dodge meteor, you cannot reflect it. So keep that in mind. Don't try to do either of those things, because it'll be for naught. But still, in PvE, this is going to be an amazing ultimate for both Stam and Magicka DPS, because it's going to deal nice initial hit, and it's going to deal nice lingering AoE damage. And furthermore, a lot of PvE entities are weak to flame damage, meaning it's going to do additional damage, it's going to proc explosion, etc. So it's going to be a really great ultimate. And now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Ice Comet, which will convert the damage from flame into frost, so it'll still use all the same scaling mechanisms, but next patch this means that it will apply minor maim instead of the burning status effect, and it will no longer proc explosion, but rather proc deep freeze on enemies that are weak to frost, which will deal some additional damage and immobilize them. So it's still going to stun, yada yada, is still going to do the lingering damage, but what it does is it increases the initial damage by a tiny little bit, about 200 tooltip, and then it's also going to reduce their movement speed by 50% for 5 seconds. So in PvP, this is usually the go-to morph, because in PvP we want as much damage as possible, so increasing our burst capabilities means Ice Comet's going to be really strong. And then furthermore, reducing an enemy's movement speed is really nice, because they're going to be stuck in that lingering damage that's ticking every 1 second for a little bit longer, because they can't run out as fast because that movement speed debuff. So locking them up in place, making sure you're getting much more efficiency out of that lingering effect out of Ice Comet. So really good in PvP and really bad in PvE. And in PvE, it doesn't seem like it would be awful, but when we look at our other morph, it's really, really not that great in PvE DPS. But our other morph is called Shooting Star, and Shooting Star is going to retain all the same good stuff: flame damage, knockback, lingering, woohoo, great. But furthermore, what it's going to do is every enemy you hit in the initial blast will restore some ultimate. So at rank 1, it'll be 9, and then if we take it at rank 4, it's going to give 12 ultimate for every enemy hit in the initial blast, up to 6 enemies. So that means we gain up to 72 ultimate back when we use the maximum efficiency out of Shooting Star, which almost halves the ultimate cost. So this is going to be an extremely, extremely great ultimate for both PvE and PvP, because that high ultimate cost is going to be extremely deceptive, because if we're getting ultimate back on AoE, then we're getting it back to cast it sooner. So that 200 ultimate cost isn't the true cost because it's giving us some ultimate generation back. So this is why it's going to be an amazing tool in PvE for both Stam and Magicka DPS. And then in PvP, if you're fighting big groups, that's going to be great as well. And then furthermore in PvP, if you want to drop meteors like mad, you can use that Shooting Star ultimate return in tandem with our Alliance Wars Combat Frenzy, which gives 20 ultimate. And then furthermore, if you're fighting vampires, which, hey, guess what? They're weak to flame damage. Shooting Star does flame damage. You're going to proc Banish the Wicked and get another 9 ultimate back. So you're getting an insane amount of ultimate back for using Shooting Star in PvP. So in terms of solo performance or dueling, Ice Comet probably going to be your go-to. But in group performance, Shooting Star, again, going to be a very strong tool if the enemy isn't blocking it, isn't shielding, etc. Because remember, you can really easily negate a lot of the damage if you do those things. But if you don't, prepare for a world of hurt. So Shooting Star, amazing ultimate for both Stam and Magicka, has use in both PvE and PvP application. Now we'll look at our passive abilities, and our first is called Persuasive Will. It's going to do the same thing that Intimidating Presence did in Fighters Guild. It's going to give us some RP options when we're questing with dialogue. It'll allow you to persuade NPCs, getting additional quest endings, skipping like fetch quests or kill quests, because you'll be able to just say, hey, look at my remarkable wittiness and listen to my amazing voice, and no longer desire me to do said task. And then they're like, okay, sure, you no longer have to do this task. So really nice for saving time if you're into questing. If you like replayability and stuff, you can get multiple endings of quests based on this and stuff. So yeah, not going to affect our combat prowess whatsoever, but it's there for questing and whatnot. Our next passive is called Mage Adept, and Mage Adept is going to reduce the magicka and health cost of our Mage's Guild abilities by 15%. So I said earlier that there wasn't a cost reduction. I was wrong. Mage Adept is going to reduce the cost of magicka and health abilities, so that means Equilibrium is going to have that health cost. I believe its base is like 20 or 2k health, maybe a little bit more. So this is going to reduce it by 15%, and then the magicka's cost of these skills. So without the magicka cost, Mage Light's going to be pretty hefty, Entropy's still going to be really cheap, and Scalding Rune's going to be pretty hefty as well. But really straightforward, helps out if you're using stuff like Scalding Rune. But in terms of meta performance, in PvE, we don't cast any of these skills except maybe Mage Light at the start of a fight, which I'll explain why we ever would do that later. But in PvP, it's going to help if we're using Entropy, if we're using Volcanic Rune, or if we're deciding to use Equilibrium on a tank or a healer or any class in PvE or in PvP, because it's going to reduce that health drain while retaining our magicka cost return. So really straightforward but nice passive. Our next passive is called Everlasting Magic, which increases the duration of our Mage's Guild abilities by 20%. And this is the busted passive. This is the useless piece of garbage that says, hey, I'm increasing your effectiveness by 20% on time-based abilities or buffs or whatever. And guess what? I actually don't even work. I increase the duration of, say, Entropy or Scalding Rune or Shooting Star, but I don't increase them in set increments where the skill can actually see a gain out of it. Remember, Entropy stops dealing damage after 10 seconds, so it gains nothing. It stops gaining you don't get a heal tick, you don't get a damage tick, it doesn't apply to major sorcery, useless. It applies to Scalding Rune. Okay, well, Scalding Rune ticks every 2 seconds, but 11.6 isn't divisible by 2. The base is 10 seconds, so we gain no additional damage. Another time where Everlasting Magic is completely useless. Everlasting Magic will not apply to Equilibrium anymore, thankfully. And then it's going to apply to Shooting Star, and it's going to be the only place where it gets a semblance of meaningfulness, because that 20% isn't going to apply fully. We're not going to get a 12-second duration, but it will go from 9.6 second duration to an 11.8. So we're going to gain one more damage source. So this is the only time where Everlasting Magic is being effective, is on Shooting Star or Ice Comet. So I would really like to see this passive fixed to actually give the benefits that it's doing, because literally right now it's a waste of skill points unless you're trying to maximize Shooting Star damage. So disappointing and extremely deceptive. Would love to see this fixed. Our next passive is called Magic Controller, and this is the one that I'm talking about where we're going to gain passive abilities just for having Mage's Guild slotted. And what this does is for each Mage's Guild ability slotted, we gain 2% max Magicka and 2% Magicka recovery. Really straightforward, and this goes up based on how many pieces. So remember, with Inner Light that gave 5% Magicka, it actually gives 7% max Magicka and 2% recovery. So that's why Inner Light is a really, really efficient skill in dealing damage application for PvE or PvP, as well as healing application for both, because it's going to increase our max Magicka pool, going to give us a little bit of recovery, meaning our damage will be higher, our heals will be higher, and then we'll be able to cast more skills because we have more Magicka to our disposal. So a really, really fantastic option. And if you're not a Nightblade, this is why you're going to main bar Shooting Star. Even if you don't use the ultimate, similarly to Flawless Dawnbreaker, you're going to use it for that passive slot, to that 2% free Magicka and 2% free recovery. So keep that in mind, that if you're trying to maximize efficiency, and even if you don't use the skill, like if you use Banner as a DK or Elemental Rage as a caster, you can still main bar Shooting Star and gain those effective stats. So really, really great way to use those. And then our last passive is called Might of the Guild, which anytime we cast a Mage's Guild ability, you grant yourself Empower, increasing the damage of your next direct damage attack by 20% for 5 seconds. So this was what I was talking about, where sometimes in PvE or in PvP we'll cast Mage Light or its morphs at the start of combat, and this is to increase our burst effectiveness. So the next casted ability we use, if it is a non-damage over time ability, it will deal 20% next damage. So we see here, I cast Mage Light and I gain that buff, Empower, and you see it at the bottom of my screen. Just means the next direct damage attack I do will deal additional damage. So let's go bop this fool in the mouth. 304, I activate Empower, and I bop him again, and I get 365, and it consumed my Empower. So it works on any direct damage attack, and the best way to use this skill is to use it with a heavy hitting ultimate, so like a Dawnbreaker of Smiting, a Shooting Star, etc. You're going to gain that 20% additional damage on that upfront damage, and it can also be used by gank builds. So in Cyrodiil, like the Nightblade's only function right now in the game is to one-shot people from stealth like an assassin, and Mage's Light, even though we have a stamina version Expert Hunter, we're still going to use Mage Light because Might of the Guild is going to make our next attack deal 20% additional damage. So if we're trying to one-shot someone from stealth or kill them insanely quickly, increasing an attack that's already doing 250% additional damage from our stealth multiplier, Might of the Guild will make it 20% stronger, meaning all the more damage, meaning a higher chance of killing our target and escaping. So this is why you see gank builds using Mage Light from stealth, is because we're going to be in stealth or invisibility, we're going to activate Mage Light, it will not remove us from stealth, and then we're going to gain that additional damage when we pop out of stealth. So a very strong tool in both PvE and PvP in terms of increasing burst damage, and many players will use this with Shooting Star in PvP. At the start of the pull, you'll activate Inner Light, drop your Shooting Star, which will get 20% additional damage because it will consume Empower on the initial hit, but not the damage over time. And then Shooting Star will also proc another Might of the Guild, meaning our next direct damage attack will get another 20% damage. So what you can do is you can pop Inner Light, drop a Meteor, and then charge a heavy attack while Meteor drops, because Meteor is going to take 2 seconds to deal damage before it lands. So that gives you an exact 2 seconds, which guess what? It takes 2 seconds to wind up a heavy attack to launch one. So you're going to get an insane amount of burst damage off at the start of a fight in both PvE and PvP. So Amazing passive, has a lot of potential in terms of utilization by the player in many different builds. And yeah, we see that the Mage's Guild skill line, while they might not be the best of the best abilities, although Shooting Star is arguably one of the best ultimates in the game in terms of like holistic application, it's a very versatile, strong ultimate. Not all of them might be best in slot, or not all of them might be good for every build, but everything has a purpose here. Mage Light, gonna be good for healers and Inner Light. Radiant Light is gonna help reduce the effectiveness of gankers. Entropy, gonna give us a source of major sorcery, so in PvP, when we want to get that buff without using pots or sets, gonna be a great optional tool. Scalding Rune, gonna be some decent damage, arguably one of the weaker skills in the line. This is the one that I think has the most potential to grow. I'd love to see something additional happen with the base morph that makes Scalding Rune and Volcanic Rune all the more impactful and incentivized to run, because right now they're just not there yet. They're in the right direction with the damage increases, but still not there. And then Equilibrium, remember, balance going to be a great option if we don't have our major buffs, and then Spell Symmetry going to be a nice option if we don't have sources like Dark Deal or Siphoning attacks, and we know that allies will heal us. So niche abilities, but extremely powerful when utilized properly. And then our passives, other than Everlasting Magic, are all really, really strong. Free stats, free duration or free cost decrease, Might of the Guild, free burst. So really, really great when we compare them to our Fighters Guild. But yeah, that has been it for the Mages Guild. I hope you have learned something useful, that you've been able to, ooh, I can incorporate this in a new build or something of the sort. You learned why the best of the best run skills that they do, etc., etc. Maybe you've learned how to finally counter those obnoxious Nightblades in Cyrodiil, Radiant Mage Light OP. So yeah, some great skills in here. But that is it for the Mages Guild skill line. Next is Undaunted, and then after that we're going to get into the Alliance War. I'm going to save Vampire and Werewolf for after Alliance War, and then we'll do Racials next to give you a sort of diagram. And then I will be on a week-long break from February 6th to 10th. I'm going to be out of town. I'll explain a little bit more when I can, but right now it's stuff getting finalized. So I will be out of town. Don't expect uploads during that duration. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you around. If you've liked the content in this video, consider pledging at my Patreon. The community's interest and support keep me inspired and drive me to continue improving and giving back. Thanks to all my patrons who've already shown their dedication. I truly appreciate it. If you have feedback, drop a comment, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or subscribe to the channel. Other than that, I will see you guys next time.